You can't be serious about this.
I've never been more serious, Chief.
The cold rain of Oak Creek hit the cracked pavement like tiny lead pellets, echoing through the quiet streets of a town that had learned to keep its mouth shut. Officer Marcus Vance leaned against the hood of his cruiser, his thick arms crossed over his chest, watching the morning shift turn into a slow, suffocating crawl. Marcus didn't just enforce the law in Oak Creek, he owned it. For 12 years, his word had been the final authority in this small county, supported by a badge that gave him impunity and a reputation built on fear. Everyone knew the unspoken rule of Oak Creek: you look down, you answer fast, and you never, ever question Officer Vance. But as Marcus reached into his leather coat for his morning coffee, the heavy glass door of the precinct swung open, and a young woman stepped out into the drizzling cold. She was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with heavy gold foil, a document that had just arrived by courier from the state capitol. Marcus sneered, stepping forward to snatch the paper from her hands, ready to tear it to shreds right there on the curb just to remind her who ran this town. But before his fingers could rip into the heavy cardstock, the girl stepped directly into his path, her voice cutting through the rain with a quiet, terrifying certainty. "I wouldn't tear that if I were you, Marcus. Because if you destroy what's inside, you aren't just tearing paper, you're signing your own arrest warrant." Marcus froze, his thumb digging into the top corner of the envelope. The paper was crisp, expensive, and carried the official crest of the governor's Judicial Oversight Committee. A slow, dark grin spread across his face as he looked down at Clara, the new transfer clerk who had arrived only 3 days ago. Clara was small, quiet, and kept her head down at her desk, barely speaking a word to the rest of the department. She wore oversized sweaters, drove a beat-up sedan, and looked like the kind of person who would apologize if you stepped on her foot. Yet here she was, standing under the rusted overhang of the police station, staring straight into the eyes of the most feared man in the county without a single flinch. Marcus chuckled, a low, rasping sound that rattled in his throat. He brought his other hand up, catching the bottom edge of the document, the tension in the thick paper making a sharp cracking sound in the damp morning air. He loved moments like this, moments where someone thought they had leverage, only to realize that in Oak Creek, leverage was whatever Marcus Vance said it was. He was about to rip the envelope directly down the middle, just to watch the hope extinguish from her eyes, when Clara leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Go ahead," she said softly, her blue eyes icy and calm. "Rip it. Destroy your own promotion letter. Tear up the official appointment of Chief of Police. But if you do, you'll never read the second page, the page that lists the mandatory federal audit attached to your new office." Marcus's hands stopped instantly. His jaw tightened, the smug smile vanishing from his face as if it had been slapped away. For years, the chief's seat had been held by old Arthur Miller, a man who had spent the last decade nodding along to whatever Marcus did, turning a blind eye to missing evidence, padded overtime sheets, and suspicious traffic stops along the highway corridor. Arthur had announced his sudden retirement only 2 weeks ago due to failing health, leaving the throne open. Everyone in the building assumed Marcus was the natural successor. It was his birthright, his reward for keeping the town under control. But Marcus hadn't expected the promotion to come down so fast, nor had he expected it to arrive through the hands of a low-level temp worker who looked at him not with fear, but with pity. Slowly, Marcus lowered his hands, pulling the envelope away from the ripping point. He stared at the golden seal, then back at Clara, trying to read the unreadable face of the girl who had just stopped him in his tracks. Clara didn't wait for him to process the shock. She turned on her heel and walked back inside the warm, fluorescent-lit lobby of the station, her boots clicking rhythmically against the scuffed linoleum. Marcus stood in the cold rain for a long moment, the heavy document trembling slightly in his grip. His mind raced. How did a brand-new clerk know the contents of a sealed document from the state capitol? Why would a standard promotion letter come attached to a federal audit? And more importantly, who was Clara really? In a town built on secrets, Marcus had spent his entire career making sure he was the one keeping them. But as he looked down at the cream-colored paper in his hand, a cold, unfamiliar knot formed in his stomach. He realized that for the first time in 12 years, the hunter was standing in a room full of shadows, and he had no idea who was holding the torch. He followed her inside, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him. The precinct was quiet, save for the dull hum of the old refrigerator in the break room and the distant chatter of a police scanner. Marcus walked straight to his desk, pulling out a brass letter opener. His heart hammered against his ribs, a feeling he hated, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his early days on the force. He sliced open the top of the envelope and pulled out the thick parchment. Just as Clara had said, the first document was a formal declaration from the State Board of Standards, appointing Officer Marcus Vance as the acting chief of police for Oak Creek, effective immediately. A surge of arrogance washed over him, momentarily washing away his anxiety. He was the chief now. He had the ultimate authority. But then his eyes fell on the second page, folded neatly behind the first. The second page wasn't written on state letterhead. It was a single, typed sheet from the Department of Justice, bearing a case number that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a notification of an internal review into the sudden, mysterious death of Officer David Miller, former Chief Arthur Miller's son, who had died in a single car crash 4 years ago while responding to a call on the county line. Marcus remembered that night vividly. He had been the first officer on the scene. He had written the accident report himself, citing slick roads and high speed, closing the case before the morning sun had even cleared the trees. The file had been locked away in the vault ever since, buried beneath 4 years of dust and administrative silence. Marcus squeezed the paper, his knuckles turning white. He looked across the bullpen toward the small corner desk where Clara was calmly organizing old case files, placing them inside yellow manila folders with deliberate, practiced precision. He stood up, walking across the room with slow, heavy steps until he was towering over her desk. Shadowing her work, he leaned down, placing both palms flat on her desk. "Who gave you this?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening whisper. "Who do you work for, Clara?" "Because I know every clerk that comes through county HR, and I've never seen your face before this week." Clara didn't flinch. She placed a file tab into a folder, pressed it down with her thumb, and finally looked up at him. Her eyes were sharp, devoid of the hesitation that usually defined the lower-level staff in the building. "I work for the town, Chief Vance," she said quietly, emphasizing his new title with a subtle hint of irony. "Just like you're supposed to. And as for David Miller's file, I didn't give you anything. The state sent that package. I just made sure you didn't destroy it before you realized what you were accepting." "David's death was an accident," Marcus hissed, bending lower so no one else in the room could hear. "It was investigated, signed off, and closed. You're playing a very dangerous game poking your nose into old business around here, little girl." Clara leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "It's funny you call it an accident, Chief. Because when David's car was pulled from the ravine 4 years ago, his service weapon was missing. His body was found in the driver's seat, but the driver's side door was unlocked, and the brake lines weren't cut by the crash, they were cut by a sharp instrument. The original mechanic's report noted that, but somehow, that page never made it into your final filing." Marcus felt the room tilt slightly. The mechanic who examined the car 4 years ago was a local named Hank, a man who had owed Marcus thousands of dollars in unpaid gambling debts. Hank had signed whatever paper Marcus put in front of him, and 3 months later, Hank had packed his bags and moved out of state, never to be heard from again. There was no way anyone in this building knew about Hank's original notes. The physical copy had been burned in an oil drum behind Marcus's garage the night after the crash. The only way Clara could possibly know that detail was if someone who was actually there had told her, or if David Miller had left something behind before he died. "You're making up stories," Marcus said, trying to force a laugh that came out flat and hollow. "And even if you weren't, you have zero proof. I run this department now. I control the archives, I control the evidence room, and I control who stays on this payroll. If you take one more step out of line, Clara, I'll have you escorted out of this building in handcuffs for falsifying official documents. Clara looked at him for a long, quiet moment, her expression softening into something that looked terrifyingly like sadness. You can fire me, Marcus, she whispered. You can even arrest me. But you can't arrest a ghost. And you certainly can't erase what David hid inside the wall of the chief's office 4 years ago, the very office you're about to move into. Before Marcus could react, the front doors of the station opened again, and old Arthur Miller shuffled inside, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. The former chief looked frail, his skin pale and translucent, his breathing shallow. He carried a small cardboard box filled with his personal belongings from his office. Arthur had been a ghost of a man ever since his son died, slowly surrendering all his power to Marcus, letting the younger officer take the reins while he retreated into bottle after bottle of whiskey. Arthur stopped when he saw Marcus standing over Clara's desk, his old, tired eyes darting between the two of me. Marcus, Arthur rasped, his voice trembling. The state, did the paperwork arrive? Marcus quickly pulled himself up, adjusting his belt and plastering on a rigid, professional mask. Yeah, Arthur. It just came in. I'm officially taking over the office today. Arthur nodded slowly, a deep, painful sigh escaping his chest. He looked at Clara, then back at Marcus, his hands shaking as he gripped his cane. Good. Good. It's time, I suppose. The office is cleared out. Everything is, left right where it belongs. Arthur walked toward the exit, but as he passed Marcus, he paused, laying a withered hand on Marcus's arm. Be careful in that room, son, the old man whispered, his voice laced with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite name. Was it regret, or warning? Some seats are heavier than they look. Marcus watched Arthur leave, his mind spinning like a wheel in the mud. He turned back to Clara, but she had already pulled another yellow folder onto her desk, her head bowed as she resumed her work, completely ignoring him as if the tense confrontation had never happened. Frustrated, angry, and deeply unnerved, Marcus turned on his heel and marched toward the heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway, the chief's office. The room smelled of old paper, stale tobacco, and polished mahogany. Sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long, cage-like shadows across the floor. Marcus stepped inside and slammed the door behind him, locking it from the inside. He stood in the center of the room, looking around at the oak paneling that lined the walls. What did David hide in here? Clara's words echoed in his mind. Inside the wall. Marcus began to search. He pulled books off the shelves, tapped along the baseboards, and pulled down the framed pictures of past police forces. His heart was hammering against his ribs, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the chilly air in the room. For 2 hours, he methodically checked every inch of the office, his frustration growing with every empty space he found. He felt like a madman, chasing the cryptic hints of an outsider who was playing psychological games with him. He was Marcus Vance, the man who controlled this town. He shouldn't be tearing apart an office because a 20-something temp clerk made a vague threat. He stopped, gasping for air, sitting down behind the heavy mahogany desk. He threw his head back, staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to rationalize everything. Maybe Clara was just a nosy activist. Maybe she was related to Hank, the mechanic. Maybe she was just guessing, picking at old wounds to see if he would bleed. He took a deep breath, opening the bottom drawer of the chief's desk to look for a bottle of bourbon he knew Arthur kept hidden. His hand reached into the dark recesses of the bottom drawer, feeling around the back panel. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. It wasn't a bottle. Marcus reached deeper, his heart stopping. Attached to the back panel of the desk drawer, hidden behind a false wooden boundary, was a small, magnetic key safe. Marcus pulled it free. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped it. Inside the safe was a single silver key with a small brass tag attached to it. Written on the tag in sharp, neat handwriting, handwriting Marcus recognized instantly as belonging to the late David Miller, were 3 words, "in case of." Marcus stared at the key. His mind flashed back to 4 years ago, to the night David died. David Miller had been different from his father and Marcus. David was young, idealistic, and believed that being a cop meant protecting people, not controlling them. In the months leading up to his death, David had begun questioning Marcus's traffic stops, asking why certain local businesses were never cited for violations, and tracking the unaccounted cash flowing through the county's evidence lockers. Marcus had warned David multiple times to mind his own business, telling him that Oak Creek worked because of a delicate balance, and that stepping outside that balance would ruin everything. But David wouldn't listen. The night David died, Marcus had followed him out to the county line. They had argued on the side of the rain-slicked highway. David had declared that he was going to the state prosecutor the next morning with evidence that would tear the Oak Creek Police Department apart. Marcus remembered the rage that had surged through him, the sudden, overwhelming panic that everything he had built, everything he had strived for, was about to be ruined by a rookie with a hero complex. They had fought. A struggle by the edge of the ravine. Marcus had grabbed David by the collar, throwing him hard against the side of his cruiser. David had fallen down the embankment, his head striking a jagged rock at the bottom. Marcus had panicked. He hadn't meant to kill him, it was an accident, a terrible, split-second mistake. But instead of calling for medical help, Marcus had made a choice. He dragged David's lifeless body into the driver's seat of his own patrol car, put the car in neutral, and pushed it deep into the dark water at the bottom of the ravine. He had cut the brake lines afterward with his pocketknife to create a cover story, then called it in as a high-speed crash. He had spent 4 years believing that secret was buried at the bottom of that dark water. Now, holding the silver key in his trembling hand, Marcus felt the room closing in on him. The key didn't belong to any lock in the station. It belonged to a safety deposit box at the local bank down the street. Marcus stuffed the key into his pocket and unlocked the office door, stepping out into the bullpen. He was determined to go straight to the bank, open that box, and destroy whatever David had left behind. But as he stepped out, he stopped dead in his tracks. Clara's desk was empty. Her jacket was gone, her purse was gone, and the yellow folders she had been organizing were stacked neatly in the center of her desk. Resting on top of the stack was a small, white envelope with Marcus's name typed on the front. Marcus walked over, his eyes darting around the quiet room. The other officers were out on patrol or eating lunch in the break room. He snatched the envelope, tore it open, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a birth certificate. Marcus's eyes scanned the names printed on the document. Name of child, Clara Miller. Name of father, David Miller. The breath left Marcus's lungs all at once, as if he had been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. Clara wasn't a random clerk from the county. She wasn't an auditor sent by the state. She was David's daughter. The granddaughter of former Chief Arthur Miller. Marcus collapsed into the chair behind Clara's desk, the piece of paper fluttering from his fingers onto the floor. Memories began to piece together in his mind with terrifying clarity. 4 years ago, when David died, he had left behind a estranged young daughter living with her mother 2 states away, a girl David rarely talked about to keep her safe from the toxic atmosphere of Oak Creek. She had been just a teenager then. Now, 4 years later, she had grown up. She had come to Oak Creek not to seek a job, but to seek the truth. And she had used Arthur. Marcus stood up abruptly, a sudden horror dawning on him. Arthur's visit this morning, the way the old man had looked at him, the strange, mournful tone in his voice, the way he had said everything is left right where it belongs. Arthur hadn't been defeated. Arthur had known. The old man had spent 4 years drinking himself to death out of grief, but he had finally figured out what Marcus had done to his son. And instead of confronting Marcus directly, Arthur had helped David's daughter execute a long, calculated trap. Marcus bolted out the front door of the precinct, ignoring the rain that was now pouring from the gray sky. He ran straight down Main Street toward the Oak Creek Community Bank, his shoes splashing through deep puddles, his police radio crackling loudly against his chest. He burst through the glass doors of the bank, his badge visible, his breathing ragged. "I need access to safety deposit box 214, Marcus demanded, slamming the silver key down on the marble counter in front of the teller. The young teller looked startled, looking from the key to Marcus's panicked face. "Sir. Chief Vance, that box was cleared out 30 minutes ago." Marcus's heart stopped. Cleared out? By who? Who had authority to open that box? "The co-owner," the teller said quietly, reaching under the counter and pulling out the bank's sign in ledger. Old Chief Miller had his name on the box alongside his son's. "He came in this morning with a young woman. They took the contents, signed the release form, and left." Marcus grabbed the ledger, staring down at the signatures on the bottom line. Arthur Miller. And right beside it, in neat, elegant script, Clara Miller. "Where did they go?" Marcus roared, grabbing the teller by the lapel of his uniform. "Where are they?" I don't know," the teller stammered, terrified. "They had a car waiting outside. A blue sedan. They said they were heading to the county courthouse." Marcus let go of the teller, turning and sprinting back out into the rain. The county courthouse was 6 miles away, at the edge of the district line, the place where state prosecutors and federal judges held circuit court. If Clara and Arthur reached that courthouse with whatever was inside that box, Marcus's life was over. The promotion, the badge, his freedom, everything would be destroyed in a single afternoon. He jumped into his cruiser, flipped on the emergency lights and siren, and slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt as the car launched forward, cutting through the quiet streets of Oak Creek like a wounded animal. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so hard his hands turned white. His mind was a chaotic storm of panic, rage, and guilt. He couldn't let them reach that building. He had to stop that blue sedan. The highway leading out of town was narrow, lined with dense woods and steep embankments, the very same highway where David Miller had lost his life 4 years ago. As Marcus crested the hill near the county line, his heart leaped into his throat. A quarter-mile ahead, kicking up a plume of white spray in the heavy rain, was Clara's beat-up blue sedan. Marcus hit the gas, closing the distance rapidly. The siren wailed into the stormy air, a terrifying sound that echoed through the trees. Through the rear window of the sedan, Marcus could see 2 silhouettes, Clara in the driver's seat, and old Arthur in the passenger side. They weren't speeding up. They weren't fleeing. Clara was driving at a steady, deliberate pace, keeping the car perfectly in the middle of the lane. Marcus pulled his cruiser up right beside her, matching her speed. He rolled down his passenger window, shouting into the wind and rain over the roar of the engines. "Pull over. Clara, pull the car over now." Clara slowly turned her head, looking at him through her closed window. Her expression was completely devoid of fear. There was no panic in her eyes, no desperate acceleration. She just looked at him with a cold, devastating calm. Beside her, old Arthur sat with his hands folded in his lap, looking straight ahead at the road, his face washed clean of the fear and hesitation he had carried for 4 years. Marcus swerved his cruiser toward her, trying to force the blue sedan onto the muddy shoulder. "Stop the car," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. Instead of pulling over, Clara slowly turned the steering wheel, taking the off-ramp that led to the scenic overlook, the exact spot where David's car had gone off the edge into the deep ravine 4 years ago. Marcus slammed on his brakes, his cruiser skidding across the wet pavement before coming to a stop near the edge of the gravel turnoff. Clara pulled her sedan to a complete stop right at the edge of the wooden guardrail, the same guardrail that had been repaired 4 years prior. Marcus tore his door open, stepping out into the freezing deluge. He pulled his service weapon from its holster, pointing it with trembling hands at the driver's side door of the blue sedan. "Get out of the car," he screamed, his voice lost in the thunder echoing overhead. "Both of you, get out of the car and put your hands where I can see them." The driver's side door opened slowly. Clara stepped out into the mud. She wore no coat against the freezing rain, her clothes immediately soaking through, but she didn't shiver. She walked around the front of the car, stopping just a few feet away from the barrel of Marcus's gun. "Put it down, Marcus," she said, her voice piercing through the storm with incredible clarity. "It's over." "It's not over," Marcus yelled, his gun shaking violently. "Give me whatever was in that bank box. Give it to me right now, or so help me God, I will shoot." Clara reached into her pocket. Marcus tightened his finger on the trigger, every muscle in his body screaming in panic. But she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, black audio cassette tape, the kind old reporters used in handheld recorders. "This was in the box," Clara said, holding it out in the palm of her hand. "David knew what you were doing, Marcus. He knew you were taking bribes from the construction company dumping toxic waste into the county watershed. He knew you were framing local kids to keep your arrest metrics high. And the night he died, he carried this recorder in his breast pocket." Marcus stared at the tiny cassette tape, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. That tape was ruined. The car was underwater for 12 hours. "The car was underwater," Clara replied, her voice dropping into a quiet, painful rhythm. "But David didn't keep the recorder in the car. When he realized you were going to attack him on the edge of this road, he threw the recorder over the embankment into a hollow log before you knocked him down. He wrote a letter detailing where he threw it and left the key in your office, knowing that eventually, his father would find the courage to look for it." Marcus felt the ground slipping beneath his feet. He looked past Clara at the passenger window of the sedan. Arthur Miller was slowly stepping out of the car, leaning heavily on his cane, carrying a small portable tape player in his frail, trembling hands. Arthur didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, terribly sad. "I gave you 12 years of my life, Marcus," the old man said, his voice breaking over the sound of the rain. "I treated you like a second son after David died. I let you take over my department because I was too weak, too broken by grief to see the truth. I thought my son died in a tragic accident. But 2 weeks ago, Clara came to my house. She showed me David's letter. She brought me here, and together, we found what my boy left behind." Arthur pressed the play button on the small recorder in his hands. A harsh static filled the air between them, followed by the distant sound of wind and rain, the audio recording from 4 years ago. Then, through the static, Marcus heard his own voice, loud, aggressive, and filled with rage. "You're not going to the state prosecutor, David. You're going to shut your mouth and take your paycheck like everyone else." Then came David's voice, clear and unwavering, "I can't do that, Marcus. This town deserves better than a bully with a badge." The sound of a scuffle echoed from the speaker, shoving, heavy breathing, the sickening thud of a body striking rock, followed by a long, horrifying silence. On the tape, Marcus's voice returned, panicked and gasping, "David? David, get up. Oh God, get up." The recording stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Marcus's gun slowly lowered until his arm hung uselessly at his side. The metallic weight of the firearm felt like lead in his fingers. The last illusion of his power, his authority, his 12-year lie, dissolved in the pouring rain. There was no defense. No spin. No cover-up that could ever erase the sound of his own voice confessing to the tragic end of a good man's life. Marcus dropped the gun into the mud at his feet. He fell to his knees on the wet gravel, burying his face in his hands as a violent sob racked his body, the first tear he had shed in over 20 years. All the anger, all the arrogance that had sustained his reign of terror over Oak Creek evaporated, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man who had traded his humanity for a title he never deserved. "Why didn't you just give the tape to the state police?" Marcus wept, his voice muffled by his hands. "Why did you come to the station today? Why did you bring me that promotion letter?" Clara walked forward, stopping just inches from where he knelt in the mud. She looked down at him, her eyes filled not with vengeance, but with a profound, quiet justice. "Because I wanted you to hold it," Clara said softly. "I wanted you to hold the ultimate power you spent your whole life hurting people to achieve. I wanted you to feel the weight of becoming chief of police for 5 minutes, so you would know exactly what you were losing when the truth took it away." From down the highway, the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the trees, not local cruisers, but the sharp, multi-toned sirens of the State Highway Patrol and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, called hours ago by Arthur Miller before they ever stepped foot in the bank. As the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the curtain of rain, casting long shadows across the dark asphalt, Clara turned and walked back to her grandfather, gently taking the old man's arm to support him against the cold wind. Marcus remained on his knees in the mud, watching the state troopers dismount from their vehicles with their weapons drawn, ready to place the handcuffs on the newly appointed chief of police. Before they pulled him up, Marcus looked at Clara one last time, the quiet temp clerk who had brought down an empire without ever raising her voice. True power isn't found in a badge, a title, or the fear you instill in others. It is found in the quiet courage to stand for the truth, even when the whole world is standing against you.